Right, ready to start painting. The exciting bit. So, I've done all of my taping out. Probably just give it a last go over with the tack cloth, just to make sure there isn't any sort of dust. Now, obviously, I've put white spirit on the front, so that's a really good way of getting the extra dust off. But obviously, I can use it on the sides and the tops, anything that I'm going to be painting on, just to get that last fine dust off. So, let's start by talking about brushes. There are so many brushes out there on the market. Probably heard of some of the more expensive ones like Kling-Ons or Stahlmeister. Now this isn't one of the ones with the sort of bound string handles, but these are really expensive brushes, lovely to use. Not my preferred choice, but a lot of people do swear by them. However, I really don't think you need to spend a lot on brushes to get a good effect, to get a really nice smooth finish. It's really about choosing the right brushes. So by all means, spend a lot on brushes, but I would say get the technique nailed first and then maybe try these out as a treat later on down the line. You don't need to go to these to ensure you get the right finish. What I use are effectively watercolour brushes. So I would go and buy regular paint brushes from the DIY stores and try and paint with them and find that I got a lot of texture, a lot of brush strokes. And I just went on a quest to find the softest brush I could, because the softer it was, the less texture you're going to get when you're painting. And eventually came up with these and others, sort of similar but sort of slightly different shapes. These usually come in a set of 3. So there's your 4-inch, there's a 3-inch, and then there's a 1-inch, looking around somewhere there. And these are by Royal and Langenickel, which is basically an artist brand. And they are literally for painting watercolours, so for doing large washes. So they're called large area brushes. And so they are really soft filaments, much softer than a regular paintbrush. But they're also much narrower, as you can see. They don't have the bulk of a regular paintbrush. And what I like about that is that it doesn't allow you to put too much paint on your brush, which I think is great when you're starting out and just starting to get the feel for products and getting the hang of painting. Now, I wasn't a natural painter by any means, so this really helped me. You're not having to deal with a lot of paint flowing off a really thick brush and then getting into a bit of a mess, trying to sort of smooth it all out. So they hold a lot less paint, which is really good. But like I said, they're also really soft. It's a really good idea to maintain your brushes and make sure that you keep these as soft as they are too, because as they get older, if they get clogged up with paint, that's what can give you more texture in your paint finishes as well. So we want to maintain them, keep them, with a little bit of dish soap and a bit of conditioner or something, literally give them a really good scrub. You can get brush combs. I use the little metal scrubbing brushes that we used in the cleaning video. I use those to clean through them, to keep them in good condition. So they might be really messy here, but they're soft here and they'd still do the job. This one is from a slightly different set, but it's, again, an artist brush. They come in different thicknesses, and these are great for more detailed areas. So I might use them for sort of the edges of things, into the detail, and they're great for legs as well. So fitting around legs, curvy legs, really nice to use. The key thing, though, is choosing the right size brush for what you're painting. So I mentioned this 1-inch brush is really good for edges because you're only having to pass it across once. So you want to choose the appropriate size brush. So if I'm going to paint something like this here, this section, this triangle, I would use one of these bigger brushes. So the less times I have to pass the brush across, the less chance there is to be any evidence of brush strokes. Having said that, when I get to doing sort of larger areas than that, I'm actually going to go from a brush and instead use a mini microfiber roller. That allows me to do much bigger surface areas and get a much smoother effect. However, you do get a little bit of texture off these rollers. So I then use what's called a laying off brush to smooth. So I'm going to show you both of these in practice and how that works, but that's how I can get a really smooth finish on really big surface areas. So I'm going to use Fusion Mineral Paint. That's my go-to. Really nice to work with, water-based paint, low odour, low VOC. sets up really hard, really grippy as well, which is what you need for masking tape design. But also it's within the range of self-sealing paints. So if I put two different colours down next to each other and then I top coat, I don't need to worry about one leaching into the other when I do that. So it's just something to be aware of if you're using anything more porous and more soluble, like a chalk paint that doesn't seal itself without putting something on top of it, or an emulsion. You know, those kind of paints that you could wipe away. When you come to put top coat on the end, your design might start to move a little bit, so just be aware of that. I really recommend using things like eggshell, satin wood, or the mineral paints, the self-sealing mineral paints, give you the best effect really. So I'm just going to decant that out. Small amounts as you go, because what's happening is the water is evaporating out the paint as it's drying. That's going to get thicker as you work, and what you're going to then get is more texture as you work. So you want to keep your paint nice and fluid, almost like pouring cream consistency. Keep the lid on, don't work out the pot. You also then stop any contaminants from going in the pot. So that's the best way to do it. So let's get, yeah, that's the one I want, I think. I'm just going to do some edges first. Turn myself around. Now, with these sort of paints, water-based paints, we work on quite thin coats. So really, a key thing to be aware of is your first coat might look awful. Don't try and make it completely opaque, you know, completely full coverage of that colour. If it's a bit see-through, it's a bit patchy, it's fine. Just keep going. It will build up by the second and third coat. And what you'll especially find is areas where I've got bare wood and some scuffed old finish, it will look patchy because it's going to sink into the bare wood area first. Again, don't worry about it. Keep the faith, keep your coats thin, and allow it to build up over the sort of adding of more coats. So I'm just going to put a little bit on my brush, and I tend to use it at sort of a 45-degree angle. So you're using almost the flats of the filament to smooth the paint on. Don't push through too hard, because then you're going to create more sort of texture from the brush. You want to sort of smooth the little bit of paint that's under the brush on. So let's just start. It's to sort of glide over the top of it rather than pushing really hard when you're going to see more texture. And the nice thing about a thin brush like that is when you've run out of paint on one side, you can just flip it over and get some more paint on the other side. And smooth it down like that. Now you do, whatever you're painting, whatever paint, need to look for little dribbles and bits being pushed onto other surfaces and smooth those. So as I'm doing that, it's coming around the front here. So I'm just going to very lightly, with the very tips of the brush, again on that angle, I'm just using this bit here, lightly just run over the top of it without pushing, and that will smooth out any of those bits that have overlapped from the other edge. So you do need to be quite sort of observant as you're doing it and looking out for gatherings of paint and bits that you want to smooth out. Now if you run out of paint as you're putting it on, so say I'm starting here and you run out of paint and you need to put a bit more on your brush and sort of pick it up again, and you end up with a little line where you've lifted off, it's a good idea to just, again with the tips of brush, just called tipping off in fact, just literally run over the top of it to give it a smooth continuous look so you don't see the stop-start effect. For mine, I'm actually going to take it in over the top and again underneath here. I will say, as a normal sort of process, I would start with my piece upside down. So I would have done this bit first, I would have done inside the cupboard, and I'd have done the underneath of these edges, and I'd have done the legs. And then I'd have tipped it back over and started working on it this way up. So it's just for the purposes of this that I'm not sort of manhandling it around doing both. But I would say my suggestion would be to start with it upside down, work on it, finish off all the coats before you turn it back over, and then you're not having to put it on its top after you've painted it. It does happen, sometimes you just realise you need to turn it back round again and you need to get to the bottom. So just something like a blanket on the ground can help if you need to put it on its painted top after you've done it. But generally, if you start at the bottom and then flip it back round and work on it that way. The other thing to say is once you've started to paint and you've sort of, I'd say about 20, 30 seconds, you don't really want to be going back over something you've just painted. Basically, you don't want to overwork the paint that you've put down. So you need to smooth it down, but move on, because that is already starting to dry. And if I put my brush over it now, I'm actually going to be taking paint off with the tips of my brush. So you start to see that sort of slightly sheeny area where it's where you've messed about with it. So we need to move fairly quickly. Don't worry if there are things you think, oh, I need to sort that out, because I'm going to show you a way that you can smooth the paint that you've put down. So really apply it, don't overwork it, move on, and then we can sort of refine how that looks in between coats. What you might also notice is that I'm painting in the direction of the grain, so my brush strokes are running along the length of the wood in the same way we were sanding. I think it's really important to keep everything flowing in the same direction. It's okay if you're painting backwards and forwards, that's all right. Although I do tip off in one direction only. In doing that, it means if there are any little tiny brush strokes, it sort of sits and lies in sort of harmony with the grain of the wood, so everything looks really nice and smooth when you do that. Now what you'll find is, this is going on, the coverage is quite good, but I can obviously see through bits of it. You'd need at least 2 coats of most colours. I'll always put 3 for selling stuff professionally, because I want to make sure that it's nice and hard wearing and robust. Some colours, really bright colours or bright whites, you might need more than 3, maybe even 4. So just to be aware of that. Let's just do this section here with a larger brush so you can see that working. Use the 2-inch brush, and then I tend to hold it quite low down rather than at the end, just for stability. And I'm going over the edge of the tape here. We're doing more on masking tape technique, but it's a good idea not to push it towards the tape. And then off. Just going to try and get that bit in there so I don't paint over the tape. I could have actually put some extra tape here just to give myself a bit more space to run off and just smooth over the top. You can see how nice and smooth that's going on. Now, if you're finding you're getting texture and you're doing all the other things right, you might want to have a little bit, think about the temperature that you're painting in. Sometimes if you're painting in a very warm place, or sunny place even, it's very tempting to paint in the garden if we're lucky enough to get sunshine, or you're painting in a warm, centrally heated room, your paint can dry a little bit too quickly. Now I shouldn't have run over that quite as slow as I did, you can just see it there. But this is obviously the first coat, so that's great, I can perfect it on the second coat. If it's drying too quickly, you're going to start to see brush strokes and your paint's going to start to thicken. So there are optimal conditions for painting, and you really want to be keeping your temperature between 10 degrees and 20 degrees. Anything over 20, it's going to get too warm and your paint's going to dry really quickly. Anything under 10, it's not going to dry quickly enough. So I always recommend having a little thermostat there so that you can check your temperatures if you are having issues with your paint. You also need to watch for humidity, for dampness in the air. So anything over about 70% humidity is going to slow your paint down drying, and it just won't dry because there's no chance for the water to evaporate out your paint. So watch those conditions, because that can make your paint and your paint finishes problematic, and it's not through no fault of your own. So just watch those conditions. If you're finding that where you're painting is warm and you can't do anything about it and your paint's drying too quickly, I suggest you grab an extender product. There's quite a few on the market. This is a General Finishes one that I use, but there are a couple of brands out there, and you basically just a small amount in your decanted paint. Don't mix it in the pot because it doesn't have a shelf life. Just mix it as you go. So I just put a little squirt in, mix it around, and then that is going to stop your paint drying out too quickly. It'll keep it nice and fluid, gives you longer to work with it as well. So it means you can smooth it over a little bit longer because it's not going to dry quite so quickly. So So I think that's a really handy product to have. If you're trying to paint an edge like this, you see here I haven't actually masked this off. Another option, if you prefer, is you can paint the edge and then just sand it clean afterwards if there's a little bit of paint goes over it. The technique for getting a really good edge, or as good as you're going to get, rather than running your brush along, which means that the end sort of filaments could sort of go onto the side, is actually to use it the other way. So pushing it out towards the edge will give you a really nice sharp line. So like so, you see that it doesn't actually then go onto the front of that piece of wood. And then I can just lightly smooth over it, sort of feather it backwards and forwards if I want to smooth that out, because obviously I've been going in the other direction. So you can do that to get your nice edge, and then I can go along there, but I'm doing it sort of further back from the edge so that the ends of my brush don't sort of tip over the edge. So that's quite a nice little way of getting a good edge. You can also run the flat of your brush like so. That's literally flat down, and that gives you a nice flat edge as well, so you can go around to do that and get yourself a line. Don't go over it like that. And then if there are any little tiny bits, I just get a bit of sandpaper afterwards and tidy it up. So it can save you quite a bit of time, especially if you're desperate to get on with the painting. And the only time that doesn't really work, of course, is where you're doing a painted edge and a painted edge. So if it would work for the first colour, but for the second colour you'd want to mask that off to try and keep a really nice straight edge between the two painted edges. Let's do a larger area now. Let's get the roller out and I'll show you how that technique works. So this is all going to be black. So to get the best, smoothest effect there, roller is the way forward. Let's get those out of the way. Now, the rollers that I'm using are a little bit different from most rollers. The Two Fussy Blokes ones, you might have heard of them, but they're actually really, really flat on the end, which means that I don't need to do cutting in, where you might have to paint edges first and then roller. And sometimes you end up with, you can sort of see the bits that you've painted are a slightly different texture from the roller. So at least with this, I can pretty much roller everything. So it's just worth pointing that out, that with using another roller, you might have to paint your edges first and then roll over the top. So, make sure my tape's stuck down well. And then I'll grab my laying off brush. And I need just to grab a little bit of kitchen roll. Just on that. So I just have to fill my roller first. Get that evenly, just paint all over it. And all over me. So this is a brush specifically for smoothing paint that's been applied by roller. It's called a laying off brush. So the technique is you roller on and then you lay it off, and it basically smooths the texture and gives as if you've brushed the whole finished by hand without the roller. So I'm going to apply this in passes, but I'm not going to do it all in one go. Oops, just trying to make sure I get into that funny little shape there. And don't roller over it onto the cabinet above. Just do it in sections. Okay. And then seem to have a little bit of something there. And then take the laying off brush, holding it quite low down again, but using it very lightly. 45-degree angle and just smoothing over the top. And then I use the kitchen roll just to keep those filaments fluffy and soft and not clogged with paint. Just trying to get that funny angle there. I probably should have put a bit more tape just to give myself the space. And then you get a super smooth finish. So I go again. So this is the technique that I would use to do large areas across the top of a sideboard. And obviously it's more usual that I would do the whole side of a piece like this. But it's same technique though, I just do it in small sections so it doesn't have a chance to start to dry on me before I can get this brush through it. I'm just trying to get that angle. Only a couple of passes over the top and then move on, leave it alone. As soon as that starts to get really cloggy and wet, you need to really wash it and dry it before you start to use it again. Once that's wet, it's going to create texture as you take it through the... Now I might need a brush here just to fill in some of this detail. Let's just give you a little close-up of how I fill the roller and apply. So I just literally take a little mini roller tray. You see that's had a bit of a hard life, but that's fine because I'm going to use the tinfoil to line it. And then I can just throw that away at the end. So this is the really thin stuff. This is not the expensive stuff. You don't need to buy super strong foil for this. I'm just going to lift it into place so I don't rip it. And then make sure it's smooth here because I'm going to be using this to roll on. So I'll put my paint in the well. And then what I'm going to do is dip my roller into the tray and then on one side and then pull it up the slope, roll it back onto that. Now it's the first time, so I'm going to do that a few times. Let's get it on the end as well. And go backwards and forwards across the way. I want to really make sure that's evenly distributed. So I'll go in. When I come back to do sort of the next coat, I'll just dip it on one side and roll it backwards and forwards. That looks quite evenly distributed. And then I'm going to basically let the weight of the roller apply the paint. If it skips and doesn't apply evenly, you haven't quite got enough paint on your roller. So I'm quite relaxed here. And all I'm doing is pushing it forward. I'm not putting any pressure down on it. And then as soon as it starts to sort of look a bit patchy, I'll just pop my roller in the tray like so. And then pull it back up, backwards and forwards, get a really even coating. And then slightly overlapping the previous section I've done. Again, not pushing down too hard and making sure that there is an even coating of paint, that it's not skipping. So I can go across the way as well, but I'll just finish off all in the same direction with the roller. Unless I'm laying off, and then I'll come behind with the brush. Okay, so I've just got my brush. I'm going to do some bits of details in there now. While I'm working, I'm going to be painting from this paint that's left in the tray here. Rather than putting my roller down in it, which is going to end up with loads of paint on the roller, which means it's going to be hard to distribute that evenly when I come to do the next coat. What I actually do is put it the other way around in the tray. So rest the handle on the end and put the roller on the slopey bit. And then it doesn't soak up more paint than it needs to while you're working from that paint and just painting. Then when I've done that coat, I'll get another piece of foil, put it over the top and crimp it and just leave it like that. And that will stop it drying out before I do the next coat. So you can see on the inside here that I've actually cut in. If you're not familiar with the term, it just literally means painting the edges before you fill the rest in with a roller. So you go around and do the detail with a smaller brush like this. Now, actually, this back bit is going to stay like that because I've just painted the edges for when the mirror goes over, just in case any sort of wood peeps through the sides, so it all sort of all looks nice and finished. But when it comes to these uprights here, obviously I need to get a small brush in because the roller's not going to get into this detail. So I'll go ahead and cut in here, down this edge. And then come behind and roll. And I tend to do it quite quickly rather than going over the whole piece and doing my cutting in bits and then roller. Try and keep the rollering sort of close to with the cutting in so that it keeps a wet edge, as they say, so that they dry together. Sometimes you can end up with quite an obvious line where the cutting in has been. So be careful to smooth that paint out so you don't end up with a ridge. And then also, when you come to do this horizontal, it's obviously really tempting to paint across like that, and obviously much more comfortable to paint across like that. But what you will find is with the thinness of paint, often you can end up seeing this band of brushstroke going the other way once you come to put the roller on. You can actually still see it through it. And if this is on the outside of a cabinet, that can catch the light and you can see the strokes going in the other direction. So what I suggest you do, obviously, do it this way first, and then use that same feathering or tipping off technique just to literally go in the right direction with the grain. And that just tapers that off, smooths it down, and then it will disappear into the rollering that you're going to do afterwards. Because this is the inside, I may decide not to lay that off. I may just leave it without using the laying off brush over the top. But what you can do is you can get a smoother effect by laying off very lightly with the roller as well. So really, it's a bit of personal choice as to what sort of effect you like. This might be smooth enough. You might think this looks, that you're happy with it. So have a little play, see which you prefer. Not everybody uses the laying off brush. That's my personal preference. But for the interior, I think that works perfectly well. So as you saw there, you can really apply it in any direction. Once you're just laying it down, watch out for those little bits. Pick any little bits you spot up straight away. You can lay it any direction, but it's how you finish it that really is going to give it that sort of nice effect at the end. So all smoothed over in the direction of the grain. And sometimes with rollers we need to kind of give it a little squeeze to get some paint into the grain. Same with sort of dabbing with a brush, but then if we just go over the top lightly, we get that nice smooth finish at the end. Just very lightly, just the weight of the roller to lay off at the end. Okay, that's touch dry now. So one of my other top tips, this one is for super smooth paint finishes. I was saying before about don't worry too much if you end up with a little bit of texture in your brush strokes and you're worried about it and you want to go and correct it. Leave it, move on. What we do, as soon as it's dry, we get a synthetic sanding pad. This one's a fine synthetic sanding pad, so it's like a 150, 180, that sort of thing. And we're just going to literally lightly sand over the top. That, once you've got your first coat on, especially because this is almost like bare wood for me, you'll be able to feel that it's a little bit rough, a little bit prickly, because the grain has swollen up a little bit with the paint. You also sometimes get little bits of fluff and specks of dust that land in it, and you can feel them to the touch. So that's really good for knocking those back. Another term for it is denibbing, so you're just taking off those little specks. But the good thing about that at the same time is if you've got any little bit of texture in your paint finish where you've brushed it down, you can then give them a bit of extra attention with that. You don't need to go crazy with this like you would when you're sanding. It's just, I call it a light whiz over. So I'm just going to go again with the grain down. Like I said, paying a bit more attention if you need to anywhere. This also helps with that build up across the tape as you put more and more coats on. So I can pay a bit of attention around the edges if any paint's come around from the front. And then along here, going again with the grain. and then just feeling it. Feels lovely and smooth. Then I'll grab my tack cloth again, and then just opening that out a bit, make it a bit fluffier. Just very light, remember no rubbing, and you'll see there's a little bit of black paint dust on there. And good to go for the second coat.